So are you guys able to see the astronaut and just the astronaut? Thumbs up. Awesome. You guys are great. Thank you for those interactions. So with the human body in space, a lot of people are very familiar with the fact that we have been doing space travel since the 1960s, and we have been doing living in space uh, due to various space labs since the 1970s, actually. So astronauts would go up for maybe a week or two at a time, or maybe a month or two at a time. And now, with the International Space Station being in low Earth orbit, and it has been in low Earth orbit since the early 2000s, we have been able to have astronauts living continuous astronauts, cosmonauts, and astronauts from other countries living continuously in space since the early 2000s. And one of the things that we've learned is there are a lot of things that actually happen to the human body, both in a very short period of time. So if they're going up and just traveling in space for a few days, there are some reactions that happen in the human body due to a lot of different factors, and we'll get into those later. But then there's also some things that happen to the human body after living in space for a longer period of time. For example, there was an astronaut. Your teacher and I were having a discussion about a study done on twin astronauts, identical twin astronauts. One of them went up and lived in space for one whole year, and his twin brother stayed here on Earth in order to be able to study truly the difference between two genetically identical people and what would happen in that environment. So uh, let's get into the hostile space environment. So, as you guys probably are aware, can't live in space without a spacesuit. Some of the things that you need in order to survive, obviously, or part of the things that make space such a hostile environment is the fact that there is no atmosphere. There is absolutely zero air pressure. There are air molecules in space, but they are so far and few between that if you took all of the molecules in our galaxy and put them together in one space, it would take up an area smaller than the size of a book. So that's how few air molecules there are outside of our environment, out in the emptiness of space. So with there being with zero air pressure, that also creates a vacuum and extreme temperature variations. So with those few air molecules, with there being very few of them at all out in space, those extreme temperature variations, because there's no way to retain a lot of heat from the sun, but it also in shadow conditions. But then it also means that when you're in the sun, you're going to have extreme heat, and there's no way to really radiate that heat off of you. So in space, when you're in low Earth orbit, those temperatures can range when you're in the sun from about, let me see, let me go back to my notes here. It was on the previous page here. The temperatures can range from about 120 degrees Celsius, which is 248 degrees Fahrenheit. So the low end of your oven is how hot it is in the sun. And then if you end up in the shade, so in the shadow of something, so whether it's the shadow of Earth, shadow of Moon, shadow of the International Space Station, if you're doing a spacewalk, or what's called extravehicular activity, then the temperature in that shaded area can go all the way down to negative 100 Celsius, which is negative 148 in the shade. So you can literally have half of your body in the sun, half of your body in the shade, which is actually what happens when you're out in space, because part of you is facing the sun, part of you is not facing the sun. So one half of your body can be 248 degrees, and the other side of your body is negative 148 if you didn't have a spacesuit on. So extremely hostile space environment with extreme temperature variations. Also, because you don't have the protection of Earth's atmosphere, there are very high radiation levels. So the spacesuits do help protect with that as well. And space also appears to be a weightless environment. Now, we say appears to be a weightless environment because technically, when you're in the low Earth orbit, you're not actually in zero gravity. You are constantly falling around the Earth. And so it seems weightless, but it's not actually. And of course, because space is highly radiated, very few air molecules, it is also a sterile and enclosed environment. So, no, to our knowledge, no germs or viruses can exist in the vacuum of space. So, any questions about the space environment or the temperatures or air molecules out in space? So I'm trying to think. I don't see anything in the chat yet, so that's cool too. All right. So, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, the human body adaptations and things that happen to the body in space start as quickly as being in space for just a few minutes. Literally, as astronauts are lifting off from Earth, going up into space, whether it's back in the day when we were using the space shuttle, and now when we are using the capsules, either in Russia or here through SpaceX, those astronauts are begin experiencing those symptoms of space adaptation fairly quickly. They can start in as quickly as a few minutes. Those adaptation symptoms will last for the first few days that they are on orbit. And because of the lack of up and down in space, because there really is no up or down. If you'll notice in that image of the two astronauts on the International Space Station, there are they have materials all over the place, and there are actually footholds and handholds all around the entire space station so they can actually turn themselves in any direction. And so they are actually able to get a lot of usage out of all of the different sides. So, because there is no floor, there is no ceiling, every wall is a wall. So they're able to attach laptops, monitors, storage equipment, all different kinds of things all over every single usable inch of space in the International Space Station is used if they can. But going back to the body adapting in space, so as you can see, one of those astronauts is upside down and one of them isn't. But your orientation as the photographer is what gives you an idea of what is up or what is down. But to the male astronaut who appears upside down to us, we actually look upside down to him, which is really interesting. So, because there is no up or down and the astronauts are kind of twirling, moving around for those first few days until their body gets used to it, the vestibular system can be affected, which means that they're potentially going to begin to exhibit some of those space adaptation symptoms, which can include headaches, nausea, loss of appetite, stuffy nose, stuffy head, dizziness, and even vomiting. Because of the fact that they're moving around so much. And because of all of this, they actually don't schedule any spacewalks, also known as extravehicular activities, during the first few days until the astronauts are totally acclimated to being in space. So, as I mentioned before, we're going to be talking about biology, chemistry, and a little bit of physics. So, this is the part where biology and physics really begin to interplay with one another, is with the body adaptation syndrome or space adaptation syndrome. And so, this starts with a fluid shift. So, this is the same astronaut. One picture was the picture on the left was taken on Earth. The picture on the right was taken up in space so that we could compare what happens, because what is actually happening in the human body and there is fluids are actually shifting around, because when you're here on Earth, gravity is pulling fluids down, right? Because gravity pulls everything down towards the Earth. Well, when you're out in space, there's no more gravity affecting the fluids in the body, and so they are going to normalize through a process called osmosis. And you can see here some of the differences. So if you take a look at the two pictures, so for those of you who are watching at home, if you want to pull up the chat and type in some of the differences that you notice for the before and after on this astronaut. And those of you who are watching in the classroom, if you guys want to raise your hand, and then Miss Rubin can unmute and you can let us know some of the visual things that you see differently between this astronaut when he was on Earth and when he was in space. By the way, this is the interactive part. So what are some of the things you guys notice that are different? He looks less happy. Yeah, his smile wasn't quite as big. I don't know if he was maybe not feeling well when they took that picture. His head looks bigger. Yeah. Because the fluid really does create like a puffy head appearance. What else do you notice?
One of the students thinks that the space picture, he looks younger. I'm wondering, are there less wrinkles maybe?
Yeah, that's very, very observant. Yeah, in the space picture, he looks younger because the excess fluid in the face is actually filling out and making the wrinkles less obvious. So yeah, if you look around his eyes, you'll notice that he has fewer fine lines and wrinkles around his eyes. So he does actually appear younger in space, and that is because of the excess fluid up there. And it also means that they have something called chicken leg syndrome because their legs actually get skinnier. So it's really funny if you're ever watching or if you ever go on like YouTube and search for any astronauts in space videos and take a look and see if they're wearing shorts. Look at the lower half of their legs. They look really skinny because a lot of the fluid does move throughout the entire body. And so their legs actually will look extremely thin. Even if you don't have something to compare it to, I trust me, you will notice their legs look skinny. And it's really kind of interesting. And that's all because of the interaction between gravity and fluids in the human body. Now, this fluid shift also creates some other things happening in the human body. But before we do that, I wanted to do a really quick experiment to show you guys what this kind of feels like. So, if you guys have, if any of you are ring wearers, what I'd like you to do is whichever hand you have rings on, I want you to put that hand down, like hang it down next to your body, and your other hand up. Now, if you have rings on both hands, just pick one. For me, I've got a ring on my left hand, no ring on my right hand. So I've got my left hand down, my right hand up. So everybody do one hand down, one hand all the way down, and the other hand up in the air. And you're going to hold it this way because I want you guys to experience a fluid shift, because you can experience a fluid shift. So your right hand in the air, and we're going to keep it here for about 60 seconds. And one of the things you'll notice as you're going through this, you should already, just from having your one arm up for a little bit, you can already begin to experience some of the feelings of the fluid shifting out of your arm that is up. You can literally feel the difference, even without it being a full 60 seconds. So this begins to show you how quickly those symptoms begin to show up with the astronauts when they go into space. And your other hand, you may not feel anything yet unless your fingers start feeling kind of fall. But then what's interesting is when after the 60 seconds is up, put one hand right next to the other and make a comparison. One hand will have a different coloration, and your hand with the ring, so I had a ring on my left hand, it's really difficult to get the ring off. And that's because there's excess fluid in my left hand, whereas earlier it was really easy now that the fluid has shifted out of my left hand, now it's a little bit easier to get the ring on and off. Oh yeah. Big difference when you do the fluid shift experiment. And that's one of the ways that I like to do to help people begin to see how quickly those shifts really begin to happen in the human body. All right, let me take a look here. Okay. Miss Rubin, how much more time do I have?
I think we have around 12, 15 more minutes.
Perfect. Okay. I just want to make sure I wasn't going over time because I've got just enough time to cover all of these. So, as I mentioned, some of that fluid shift does have additional effects on different parts of the human body. So, because of all of the fluid shift, one of the things that happen is the kidneys actually kick into high gear because they think the fluid levels are too high because there's more fluid in the blood than there normally would be because that's how the fluid moves throughout the body is through the blood system. And so the kidneys start kicking in and it starts eliminating that excess fluid. So the first couple of days that astronauts are in space, they do not feel thirsty. So they actually drink less. And if they're not careful, they can actually begin to create kidney stones because of that. Now they do try to make sure that even though they don't feel thirsty, they have reminders going off to drink more often because they aren't actually overhydrated. So if they're not careful, they can become dehydrated because of the kidneys forcing them to urinate more often. The other thing that happens is the heart doesn't have to work as hard because it's in space. It's not having to work against gravity. So, depending on how long an astronaut is going to be living in space, they will actually have to do extra cardiac workouts to make sure that their heart muscle doesn't shrink. So, if they're only going to be in space for a few days, they may not work out as hard as someone who's going to be in space for a few months. So, but there may still be a little bit of heart muscle shrinkage over those few days just because the heart isn't having to work anywhere near as hard because it's not fighting gravity. As I mentioned, kidney stones are also a potential thing for astronauts because of the loss of calcium in the bones. And though that calcium, when there's no extra weight on the bones from astronauts walking around and moving as if they normally would on Earth, because they're floating around, the bones are being used less. And so they actually begin to leach calcium and the the body carries that away and it gets filtered out in the kidneys along with potentially creating those kidney stones. So they have to make sure that they increase their fluid intake to make sure that they don't get the kidney stone so it flushes out the calcium before it has a chance to turn into a stone. And the picture on the left side here is actually a space toilet, which tends to be people's favorite thing to see because if you've never thought about it, going to the bathroom in space is very different than going to the bathroom on Earth because there's no gravity. So, the way astronauts use a bathroom is you see the black hose there, that is for urine. So, um, men have one attachment, males have one attachment that goes onto the hose for them to urinate into. And then there is a vacuum that actually, a very gentle vacuum that pulls the urine into a tank. And then there's a separate attachment for the female astronauts for them to use the restroom. And again, gentle vacuum pulls the urine into a tank. For number two, they actually sit down and they do sit on that very small seat. You'll notice down on the wall in front of the toilet seat, there are some foot pads and they actually lock those foot pads up into place, lock their feet into place because otherwise your legs will start floating while you're in the middle of going to the bathroom. And what you see there are some handles, but there are actually on the ISS there are some leg locks that will actually push down on the thighs to keep the astronauts seated in on the toilet, and then when they're ready to go, there is a gentle vacuum that they turn on to help pull the fecal waste into a separate tank. So that way they have all of that. And then they do for the space shuttle, and I believe it's true for the I'm sorry, for the space shuttle, they used to release the urine out into space. They did not keep it in the tank because they did not want to return to Earth with a tank full of fluid. They wanted to actually lower the weight of the shuttle on its return to Earth. But for the International Space Station, they actually clean out and recycle urine to be used as water. So it can either be used for drink. It is the urine is cleaned so well it can actually be turned into drinking water, although they often use it for other things such as cleaning purposes. So there's that. Here's the part where we really get to talk about the chemistry of the human body in space. Which is when the astronauts are in space, the muscles and the bones do atrophy. Our bodies are designed to be earthbound. And so for every month an astronaut is in space, they will lose approximately 7.5 grams of calcium from their bones each month. And so as I mentioned, that will go through the body into the kidneys. And if they don't flush it out with enough water, they could cause kidney stones. The other thing that happens is vitamin D levels, which actually do maintain your calcium levels in the blood, also goes down because, of course, the astronauts are not being exposed to sunlight. So their vitamin D levels actually drop quite a bit unless they supplement while they are in space. Now, in order to minimize their muscle and bone losses, they do work out. They work out vigorously. But they do end up using bungee cords and elastic bands to hold them onto the equipment and provide resistance while they are up in space. So on the far left is an astronaut on a treadmill. So they have a belt with bungee cords that hold them down so that they can actually run. Although the treadmill is a very small treadmill compared to what you would see here on Earth, we don't in space. They don't need a big one. They just need it to be big enough for them to actually um, get their feet on, which is pretty interesting. The one in the middle is resistance training. So they actually bungee themselves to a wall and then do their best to pull or walk away from the wall because again they're trying to create core muscle resistance. And then on the far right, the large picture is the bicycle that they have. And you'll notice, like I said, they literally use every bit of space. So when they're not working out on the bicycle can actually fold down into either the floor of the wall of the ISS that you see there. Any questions about working out? I know this tends to be a time when people have questions about this. Giving people time to type in the chat as well. No questions? Awesome. Okay. That tells me I'm doing pretty well, I hope. And all right. So I do have a question for you. For those of you who are listening at home, get ready to pull out your reaction buttons. How many of you would like to get anywhere from 2 to 3 inches taller? Anybody interested in getting taller? Yeah. Well, one of the things you can do is actually go into space because when astronauts are in space, their spine will actually grow. Because do you guys want to either type in the chat or raise your hand and let me know why is it that you think astronauts' spines get longer when they're in space? How can the spine grow when you're in space? Benny, do you have your hand up? Nope. Okay. How is it that you think the spine can how can the spine grow in space? Well, what do you guys know about spinal anatomy? Yes, Benny said, yeah. So Desby says there's no pressure. Benny says there's no gravity compressing it. So think about spinal anatomy, the different parts of the spine, right? What are the parts of the spine? Well, there's the bone, the vertebrae, which are made out of bone, but then there are the, oh, and it just left, the word just left my head. um, there are the discs, sorry, the discs in between that are made of, oh, the same thing that your nose is made out of. Why can I not? Words have left my head today, y'all. I'm sorry. Cartilage. Thank you. The cartilage vertebrae are very cartilage vertebrae is actually very spongy. So when you're here on Earth during the day, you actually get shorter. So if you want to measure taller, measure yourself in the morning right after you get out of bed. Then measure yourself before you go to bed later that night, and you will actually find that you've probably lost up to a quarter of an inch in height in just a few hours from just sitting or standing around your classroom or being in life, right? So, because gravity is compressing every single one of those discs between your vertebrae. But when you're out in space, there's no more gravity compressing it. So they actually design the spacesuits to accommodate this 2 to 3 inch height increase. Now, spacesuits are designed so only for astronauts who are 6'2" or shorter. But that means that once an astronaut is up in space, they could get as tall as 6'5" because they have larger vertebrae who have more compression to release. So the taller you are, you actually get taller in space. The smaller astronauts don't grow as much. So they're the ones, shorter astronauts tend to grow only about 2 inches. Taller astronauts will tend to grow the full 3 inches. So why should astronauts wear a spacesuit? Well, as we talked about, space is a very hostile environment to the human body. We were literally made or have evolved to live on Earth. And so, if you did not wear a spacesuit, you would become unconscious within 15 seconds. Your blood would boil because you're in 248-degree temperature, but then it would also freeze. Your tissues in your body would expand because, again, there's no air pressure. So everything would expand. Our bodies are used to having 15 pounds of pressure on us just in the air. And your body would also be exposed to high levels of radiation. Again, when you're not within our atmosphere, without our ozone protecting us, those levels of radiation would literally burn your skin within just a few minutes. And then your body would also be hit by particles that are moving at high speeds. Now, any astronaut who is traveling with the International Space Station, of course, they're always attached to whatever space station or capsule that they are traveling with. They're always bungee to it, which means they're traveling at a speed of about 17,500 miles per hour. Now, many particles traveling through space are traveling through space because they were part of an explosion at some point. Well, if nothing has slowed that particle down since its explosion, it could be traveling at a rate of speed much higher than that. So, but we know that the astronauts themselves are traveling at 17,500 miles per hour, which can create quite a bit of impact. That's faster than a speeding bullet. And that's really the end of my presentation because I wanted to leave time for any questions that you guys would have at this point. As I mentioned, it's biology, chemistry, and physics all wrapped up in one. So what questions do you guys have at this point?
All right, so do the astronauts' heights change at all, like permanently when they come back, or do they go exactly back to the same height that they were.
What do you think?
I don't know.
Well, when they were in space, they grew. They were a certain height when they were on Earth before they went to space. What happens when they go back to Earth?
They'd just be the same.
Yeah, they would go back to the previous height that they were before they were in space traveling, because gravity will go back and affect them. So oftentimes for a few days after astronauts return from space, they have a lot of back and muscle aches because their body is readjusting to the height difference. Great question.
Are there any permanent changes?
There could be. That's part of why they did the twin study. So if you guys want more information, I don't have time to go into all of the things that they found from the identical twin study. But you guys can very easily Google it, because because that study was conducted by NASA, we as the American public have access to all of that information. So the names of the two astronauts are Mark and Scott Kelly. Kelly, Mark and Scott Kelly. They are identical twin astronauts. They both at one point or another were commanders of space mission teams. And like I said, one of them stayed on Earth and one of them went up in space and lived there for a whole year. And all of the results of that study were released just a few years ago. And in that study, they do address some of those things because if I remember, Scott was the one who stayed on Earth and Mark was the one who went into space. And they didn't release any of the data till over a year after he returned, because they wanted to see what was still true with his body and all of his testing 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months out. And I'm sure they'll continue to do testing on him to see what else is different. But they did actually say that the astronaut the twin brother who was in space actually did age more than his twin brother because he lived in a highly radioactive area for over a year. It aged him faster. Great question, though. Well, thank you guys for having me today. I really enjoyed getting to teach this with you guys again. And just know that if you ever have any more questions, you can go to nasa.gov and they've got amazing information there if you want to learn more about the human body in space.
Thank you so much, Miss Bellinger. We thoroughly enjoyed this.
Oh, good. I'm glad that you guys liked it.
Thank you so much.
You are welcome. Thank you, guys. Everybody have a great day.